So aggregate supply is a relationship between quantity of real GDP supplied and the price level when all other influences on production plans remain the same. The aggregate supply curve is positive slope, so we're going to call it beta. We're going to call the slope of aggregate supply beta. Firms maximize profits if prices increase while all other costs are constant. Production rises because it is more profitable. Firm supply, industry supply curve, industry supply and aggregate supply all slope up. Alternatively, when price level rises with constant wages, real wages fall, employment rises, and the quantity of real GDP supplied rises. Shifters of the aggregate supply curve, and these are listed in a couple of different parts of the book. When the nominal wage rate changes, the book calls it the money wage rate, but this is the nominal wage rate. The nominal prices of other resources, of other production inputs, change, P. Government changes a supply side tax, or anything changing potential GDP. That's exactly what your book says. Anything that changes potential GDP will change aggregate supply. And recall from the previous example, the previous model, advances in technology, Z, increase in the size of the labor force, L, increase public or private investment in capital, K, increase land and natural resources, R, all shift aggregate supply. Now these are all long-run variables. Here the labor force, L, is not the number of laborers in an economy. In this context, L is the size of the labor force. And all of these are long-run factors. These things are short-run factors. Okay? These three things change in the short run, and they change in the long run. These things change only over the long run. So the general form of the aggregate supply curve is going to look a lot like the aggregate demand curve, with the price level on the left and real GDP way over on the right. Okay? So we have nominal wages, nominal prices of production inputs, supply side taxes, technology, capital, resources, and the labor force. Along the aggregate supply curve, the only influence on production plans that changes is price level. That is, the quantity of real GDP supplied increases when the price level rises. Quantity of real GDP supplied decreases when the price level falls. So let's just do an example. Suppose nominal wages are $400 per week. Nominal prices of other production inputs are $230 per week. We have a supply side tax rate of 15.75%. Technology known to man is 1%. Accumulated capital of 100 million machines, roads, and networks, 100 million acres of land and barrels of oil, and a labor force of 144 million workers. So, like before, we just plug in the numbers. The nominal wage rate is $400. The nominal prices of other production inputs are $230 per week. Supply side taxes are 15.75%. Technology is 1%. Capital is 100 million units. Resources are 400. The labor force is 144 million workers. Doing the arithmetic yields an aggregate supply curve of 0.75 plus 0.5y. Now, if real GDP is 0, the price level must be what? 0.75. It's not very large at all. When real GDP is $12 trillion, the price level is, well, half of 12 is 6. 6 plus 0.75 is 6.75. So let's graph the aggregate supply curve. Okay, so we find real GDP equal to 0 right here. We go up to 0.75 and stop and make a dot. And then we find real GDP out here at 12. We go up until we get to 6.75. Remember, this is in thousands. This is 6,750. We make a dot there. The aggregate supply curve is the line that passes through both points. Now let's ask a question. What happens if government cuts supply side taxes to 15%, from 15.75 to 15? Now, if you recall, one of the biggest things that President Obama has done, he makes the argument that he's cut payroll taxes. Okay, so he's cutting payroll taxes, and then In December of 2011, Congress and the President extended the payroll tax another 2 months. Okay, so that you can think of this as a supply-side tax cut. Okay, so how does cutting supply-side taxes affect aggregate supply? Well, instead of 15.7, right, the tax rate's cut down to 15%. Okay, so what happens to the aggregate supply curve? Well, the intercept is now 0, right? Think about it. It was 15.75, right? Now we lower it by 0.75 from 15.75 to 15. So the intercept is gone. So the aggregate supply curve now passes through the origin. This increases real GDP provided the price level remains at 6.75. So let's graph potential GDP, full employment output equal to 12, with the aggregate supply curve found in part 1 using the supply curve we just graphed, right? Full employment output is 12 trillion, right? If I plug 12 in to the aggregate supply curve, I get 6.75. If real GDP equals full employment output, then the price level is 6.75. The reason why that might be is because maybe the demand curve passes through that point, right? Because remember, demand and supply determine real GDP. So if real GDP equals full employment output of 12 trillion, then the price level is 6.75 because demand passes through this point. Now, if the price level is greater than 6.75, then real GDP exceeds potential. And how is this possible? Well, the demand curve must be out here, right? So if the demand curve's out here, then we're in what we call an inflationary gap. Now, if the price level is less than 6.75, then the demand curve must be passing through this red dot, right? In that case, we would be in a recessionary gap because real GDP is less than full employment output. Okay, show what happens to aggregate supply and full employment output when technology increases. Okay, now remember, technology enters both the aggregate supply curve and the full employment and the output curve, right? The output curve gives us full employment output. So technology will shift both of them, right? So full employment output immediately moves to the right. What does aggregate supply do? Well, technology goes up, which means the aggregate supply curve shifts down. And remember, when supply shifts down, that is an increase in supply. Because you can think about it as this. Supply curves that shift down are like the marginal cost curves that firms have that are shifting down. And when marginal cost curves shift down, that means firm supply is increasing. That means industry supply curves are increasing, and that means aggregate supply is increasing. So the aggregate supply curve will shift to the right by the same amount as full employment output when we hold the prices constant, right? So both shift the same amount in the same direction. Now the same could be said of capital, resources, and labor. If the money wage rate, the supply side taxes, and the nominal prices of other production inputs change, only the aggregate supply curve change. Now we want to graph aggregate supply with potential GDP and aggregate demand below. So aggregate demand is from the first part of this lecture. Full employment output is from the second part of this lecture. And then we have aggregate supply. Aggregate supply passes through the point corresponding to 12 and $6.75 thousand dollars. So in this scenario, the equilibrium GDP level is equal to full employment output. Therefore, unemployment is equal to the natural rate, and we're on the production possibility frontier. The goal of policymakers, again, is to keep real GDP as close to full employment output as possible. They want growth at 3 to 4%. They want inflation at 2%, and they want unemployment around 5 to 6%. A good way to remember it is 3 plus 2 is 5, or 4 plus 2 is 6. So aggregate supply decreases. Remember, an increase in marginal cost, which this represents, is a decrease in supply. So aggregate supply decreases if the wage, price, nominal prices of other production inputs go up, like fuel, energy, taxes go up, supply side taxes go up, or technology falls. I'm not sure how that would happen. Capital falls. Maybe that happens because of war or a natural disaster. Resources deplete. For example, in Saudi Arabia, a lot of people believe that Saudi Arabia is on the cusp, is on the declining part of production in terms of crude oil. So as their crude oil production falls, so too will their aggregate supply curve. And then labor. Well, a labor force can fall over time because maybe families are having fewer and fewer kids. So the young people that are replacing the retired workers, there are more retired workers retiring than there are workers replacing them. So a low birth rate is one of the reasons why Europe is having problems, because they don't have enough young people to support all the people that are retiring on the government pension program, which is similar to the American Social Security system. Likewise, aggregate supply increases if nominal wages fall, inputs to production like fuel and energy fall, supply side taxes are cut, or technology grows, capital grows, resources grow, and the labor force expands. Again, the Congress and President are in charge of fiscal policy. Expansionary fiscal policy involves cutting T. So if government cuts supply side taxes, which is when you hear a supply side cutter or supply sider, a supply sider wants fiscal policy to focus on the supply side instead of the demand side. So supply siders are typically like President Reagan. Okay, so supply sider wants supply side taxes cut. And we're going to get into more about supply side taxes in the next lecture. Restrictive supply side fiscal policy involves, on the supply side, involves raising payroll taxes or other supply side taxes. The Federal Reserve, our central bank, is in charge of monetary policy. Expansionary monetary policy lowers the federal funds rate, which in this model does nothing to nominal wages, nominal prices of other production inputs, or supply side taxes. So the Fed has no ability to affect the aggregate supply curve in the short run. Now, if the Fed lowers the federal funds rate and keeps it there for a while, then businesses might go out and build new factories, which could increase K, but that would be over the long run. And then firms might go out, borrowing costs are very low, they might go out and try to find new oil reserves or new natural gas reserves. And then they might start drilling for the oil. So R would go up. Okay? Now you can think about L, if the federal funds rate is lowered and real rates of interest go down, then more people might go off and get a college education, which would do what? It would make workers more productive, maybe. So you can either think of that as increasing L or maybe increasing K, because K, remember, is human capital and physical capital. Restrictive monetary policy involves raising the federal funds rate. Again, nothing's going to happen to the supply curve in the short run, because none of these variables change in the short run. Over the long run, right, if interest rates are higher, then less capital is going to not increase as much as maybe it would have if interest rates are smaller. Same thing with R. The Fed has very little control in the short run over the aggregate supply curve. Okay, now let's model an inflationary gap. Suppose potential GDP is $11 trillion in aggregate supply and aggregate demand are given by these two equations. This is the aggregate supply curve because that's positive, and that is the slope of real GDP. This is the aggregate demand curve because this is negative, and that's the slope of real GDP. So at this point, we've already plugged in wealth, future expected income, the real rate of interest, the MPC, the MPS, the real GDP, or the tax revenues net of transfers, investment, exports, government spending. We've plugged in the money wage rate, the money wage rate, the nominal price of other production inputs, supply side tax rate, technology, capital, labor, and resources have all been plugged into here. Okay, so given that you can do all that plugging and chugging, let's graph both these let's graph these demand and supply. Let's graph the demand and supply curve in the grid below. Okay, so first of all, given to you is the fact that potential GDP or full employment output is $11 trillion. So first we're going to graph the demand curve. And I know this is the demand curve because, again, the slope is negative. So one way to do it, one real quick, efficient way to do this is instead of picking some random GDP level, pick the potential GDP level, right? Plug that in. So if potential GDP is $11 trillion, then the price level is 9.75 or $9,750. Okay? And then, of course, there's the intercept, and the intercept is higher than 9.75, and the demand curve is downward sloping. So for the aggregate supply curve, let's plug 11 in, and we get 8, right? So we get 8 somewhere down here. The aggregate supply curve's intercept is a negative 0.25. Okay, so and the aggregate supply curve slopes up. Now, full employment output is greater than, full employment output is less than real GDP. Real GDP is determined by the intersection of aggregate demand and aggregate supply, which also determines the price level. So let's calculate the price level at which quantity of real GDP demanded and quantity of real GDP supplied are equal. So what we have to do here is we have to set the supply curve equal to the demand curve. Again, this is the demand curve because we have a negative slope. This is the supply curve because we have a positive slope. Okay, so what do we do here? We took and we added 0.25 to both sides, right? 0.25 plus a negative 0.25 is 0, leaving it with just this on the left-hand side. We add 0.25 to this side, so 15.25 becomes 15.5. Now we got to add 0.5y to both sides, and we get 1.25y. Now we got to divide both sides by 1.25. So we get real GDP equal to 12.4. Now let's just double check. Remember, the price levels were assumed to be equal, right? This equals a price level, and this equals a price level. So setting them equal to each other means the price levels of both equations are the same at this level of GDP. So we plug in 12.4. We plug in 12.4 to the demand curve, to the supply curve, and we get 9.05. They're the same. So we must have done it right. So the price level, the equilibrium price level is 9.05. That price level means GDP supplied equals GDP demanded. And that is greater than full employment output. So in this scenario here, the unemployment rate, according to the Fed, would be too low. Now, we've already defined what recessionary and inflationary gaps are. So this one's obviously an inflationary gap, right? It says it up here. But why is it called an inflationary gap? Well, let's figure this out. Let's use some logic here and figure out why it's called an inflationary gap. Since real GDP exceeds potential GDP, the economy is in an inflationary gap. Workers work overtime, which means their wages are, after 40 hours, the wage goes from, if you're being paid $10 regularly, the wage goes up to $15. If you're getting paid $20 normally, the wage after 40 hours a week is $30. So the average wage is going to rise in the economy. Also, maybe firms want to avoid paying overtime wages, so they're trying to recruit workers. General Motors is trying to recruit workers from maybe Ford or Toyota. And they say, if you come work for us, we'll give you higher wages and better benefits. Either way, wages go up, right? So the unemployment rate is, say, 4%, right? Which is lower than the 5%. For these reasons, there are upward pressures on wages. So wages want to rise, and wages will continue to rise until, as the wages rise, so too does the aggregate supply curve, right? Because remember, the aggregate supply curve is the sum of industry curves. The sum of industry, and the industry curve is the sum of firm curves, and firm curves were, as we said earlier, marginal cost curves. So as the marginal cost rise, so too does the aggregate supply curve shifts up, which is a decrease in aggregate supply. And the wages will continue to rise until the gap is closed. So we went from a low price, right, to higher prices. That's why this is called an inflationary gap. So if government doesn't do anything and just stays out of it, hands off or laissez-faire, then the result is higher prices, and that's why it's called an inflationary gap. Now, it's my opinion that this kind of inflation is fine because firms are going to, when wages rise, firms are going to find ways to cut cost. Supermarkets will adopt technologies like self-checkout lanes, or they'll buy banks of lasers to scan people's groceries in their grocery cart and not let them out of the store until they swipe a card, like a debit card, a Visa card, or an EBT card. Allowing gaps to close on their own via changes in wages is a laissez-faire policy, as I mentioned earlier. Today, inflationary gaps tend to close very fast. The inflation redistributes income from those on fixed incomes to those with variable incomes. Okay? Now, in some instances, it might seem like inflation is a good thing, right? If you're selling something and there's inflation, that's good because you're going to get a higher price than what you paid for it. So instead of, if you buy a house and there's inflation, when you get ready to sell that house, inflation has caused the price of the home to rise. Now, if you're a buyer of a home, right, if you're a new worker and there's inflation, it's going to be more difficult for you to buy that home. So inflation is not necessarily a good thing. Now, governments have also used inflation as a tax to avoid cutting G or increasing T. When governments run big deficits and they print a bunch of money to buy those deficits, well, that's a form of taxation because eventually there's going to be inflation. And we've talked about how inflation can be a tax. Now let's do a recessionary gap. Suppose potential GDP is $13 trillion now. Notice that demand and supply haven't changed. They're the same exact equations. The only thing that has changed here is real GDP is now potential GDP is now $13 trillion. Okay, so it's out there further. Okay, so we graph the aggregate supply curve. I know this is the aggregate supply curve because that's positive. I plug in 13, which is the potential GDP level, and I get a price level of 9.5. Now the intercept is negative 0.25, right? So the aggregate supply curve starts at negative 0.25 and passes through this point that's on the full employment output line. Now what about aggregate demand? I plug 13 trillion into the aggregate demand equation and I get 8.75, right? With the intercept being 15.25, the aggregate demand curve passes through this point down here. Now I want to calculate the equilibrium. Well, remember the equations haven't changed, so the equilibrium is the same, right? We set the supply curve equal to the demand curve, do a little arithmetic, and remember GDP is 12.4. That's less than 13 trillion. Let's do a check. Plug in 12.4, we get 9.05. Plug in 12.4 into the demand curve, we get 9.05. That's exactly what we did previously. The only difference now is that full employment output is larger than 12.4 trillion. So now we're in what we call a recessionary gap. Unemployment's high. Real GDP is lower than what it should be. Okay? Which is a recessionary gap. Now, they used to be called deflationary gaps, or they can be called deflationary gaps. Because if government does nothing, then aggregate supply will shift down until we get to this point here as wages fall. Okay, so this is a recessionary gap because GDP is less than potential. Factories, resources, and workers are not being fully utilized. So the unemployment rate is, say, high like it is right now at 8.5, which is higher than the natural rate of unemployment at 5 or 6. So the surplus of workers bids down wages. If government doesn't intervene to close this gap, the surplus workers will bid down wages, which lowers aggregate supply until the gap is closed. Okay? Remember, when wages fall, marginal cost curves fall, which are increases in supply. Increased supply means industry supply curves increase, which means aggregate supply curves increase. So aggregate supply increases here, closing the gap without any government intervention. Well, the problem is we have deflation now. Prices went from being high to being low. And now that might sound like a good idea, But think about this. Suppose you own a car, right? You bought it for 30, right? You owe $30,000 on it. You drive it off the lot. It's only worth $25,000, so you're upside down on the loan to begin with by $5,000. If an economy has deflation, that car might deflate to $20,000. You still owe $30,000 on it. As the value of the car and the amount that you borrowed widens, you're more likely to throw the keys back to the bank. You're going to drive the car to the bank and give your banker your car keys. So deflation is not necessarily a good thing. Same thing with a home. If you buy a home, right, and you had a 20% down payment, but home prices fall by 20%, all of a sudden you have no equity. If home prices fall another 20%, now all of a sudden you're 20% underwater, and you're more likely to give the bank the keys. If government does nothing, laissez-faire, which was the case before the 1930s, if the government does nothing when unemployment is high, prices in general fall. A negative relationship, right? Today, recessionary gaps, though, close relatively slow because since the 1930s, we've adopted all kinds of safety nets. There are food stamp programs. There are welfare programs. We have unemployment insurance, which unemployment benefits used to last 26 weeks. Now they can go up to 99 weeks. We have government-provided health insurance, right? We have disability insurance. We have Social Security. You can retire at 62 and 60 instead of 65. All these safety nets mean what? People are willing to maybe not look for work, take benefits out for a longer period of time, and wait for the right job. They're not willing to do like the boxer in Cinderella Man did, where he had to go to the dock and he had to beg for work on the docks, right? Remember that? Cinderella Man with Russell Crowe? Well, all these programs, all these safety nets mean what? People's reservation wages don't fall as rapidly as they used to in the 1920s. So these recessionary gaps can take a long time, and that's why we don't call them deflationary gaps anymore. We call them recessionary gaps. And then on top of that, we have a federal minimum wage. So if wages, for example, if people would be willing, they're starving, they got to feed a family, they ran out of unemployment, they ran out of, they don't qualify for maybe welfare in a state, they can't get disability, they can't retire early on Social Security. Well, maybe their reservation wage fell so much that it's below the minimum wage level. Well, they can't work for that lower wage. They have to work at the minimum wage, which during a recession creates more unemployment. So there's all kinds of impediments to the self-correcting mechanism when we're in a recessionary gap. All the safety nets, union contracts, and minimum wage laws make it very difficult for the wage to fall to clear the labor market. Now, deflation, like I said, sounds great because lower prices raise purchasing power. But you got to remember, for every buyer, there is a seller, right? So it might be better for buyers, but it's also worse. But it's also at the same time worse for sellers. Deflation amplifies debt since it was incurred when wages were higher. The same payment with a lower wage reduces purchasing power. Deflation amplifies a loan's interest. Okay, let's look at an induced inflationary gap. Okay, suppose potential GDP is 12.4 trillion. Now, remember, we have the same supply curve, the same demand curve. So, if full employment output is 12.4 trillion, right, then aggregate supply and aggregate demand are going to meet at full employment output. We already know this. We've already calculated these numbers, right? So I'm going to just go through them quicker. Okay, now, we're exactly where we want, right? But what do politicians want to do? Every couple of years, every member of the House has to be reelected. 1/3 of the Senate has to be reelected, right? And they want to show people that they're doing something. So Republicans are always proposing temporary tax cuts. Democrats are always proposing a temporary increase in government spending, probably get reelected, right? So happens if policymakers in a scenario like this decide to cut taxes or increase G to improve their chances of getting reelected? Well, cutting T, tax revenues or tax rates, which lowers tax revenues, and increasing G, government spending, does what? It does nothing to the aggregate supply curve. But what does it do to the aggregate demand curve? Well, the cut in T raises the aggregate demand curve. The increase in G raises the aggregate demand curve. So government can put us in an inflationary gap. And typically when this happens, the Fed steps in and raises interest rates to counter this stimulation of the economy. So this temporarily boosts GDP, but at the same time raises the price level. So things get more expensive, unemployment dips, hopefully right before an election, right? People see their wages going up. They don't really notice prices going up because their wages are going up. GDP is higher, everybody's working, everybody's happy. Then all of a sudden what happens? Well, wages are now higher. The aggregate supply curve shifts up. So this well-intentioned policy of boosting output in the short run has what kind of effect? It has no effect on output. Output increased and then it fell right back down. And all we get is inflation out of this deal.